All right, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the effect of household income on student ACT scores. My big research question was going to be, what is the effect of a school community's income level on its high school ACT scores in Kentucky? In short, does family income equal success on the ACT and other standardized tests like it? My research question, because of the way it was asked, lends itself to being a quantitative approach, and that's because we're dealing with a lot of data and a lot of numbers, and things like interviews, for example, or eyewitness testimony probably aren't going to be as applicable to this question as maybe other research questions out there. So basically what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking the ACT scores that are reported each year, and we're going to be separating them into two separate categories. One is going to be the top 50 schools in the state by ACT average, and then we're going to have another set of data, which is the bottom 50 high schools in Kentucky by ACT average. Then we're going to look at them and we're going to say, what kind of traits do each one of them have? Is there a definitive difference in the income level from the areas that those schools draw from? And if so, is that significant enough to test that hypothesis that we have? So my hypothesis is that there's going to be a significant impact on ACT scores and income. And I'm drawing this not from a whole lot of data or prior research. This was basically just me saying, I've worked in a few different districts. I've noticed differences in ACT scores, and they just happen to correspond with income level. As far as the data collection method, as kind of we said before, we're getting our data because ACT puts out each school's composite score, and that's for everyone can see. It's all public domain. It's part of the Kentucky Score Report Card. So we're going to be drawing upon that data. And then we're also going to be using data that the U.S. Census provides for median household incomes. And luckily for us, the U.S. Census publishes that based on zip code. And so if we know the zip code of the school, we can find out the income for that school surrounding community. And then if we need to, we can supplement literature reviews, other studies that are relevant from WKU library databases. The data visualizations tools are going to be primarily Tableau and Google Sheets. The intent we're going to use is we're going to use some scatter plots to kind of display ACT scores versus income. And if there's going to be a correlation, we should see a pretty solid line of best fit, pretty solid, linear regression test that starts to kind of show itself. All right, so for the procedure, instead of me reading this line by line, I'm going to show you a brief animation that I made earlier using Powtoon. When it comes to the actual research subjects, we're mostly looking at the families of the students, and we're looking at the past performances of Kentucky high schools. And we're going to be looking at the median income of those zip codes around the school. So we're dealing with entire high schools instead of individual students. When we looked at the literature review, we saw a mix of different things that researchers were putting out. Some of them had definitive answers one way or the other for connections between variables and ACT and SAT performances, and some of them are a little more ambiguous. National Longitudinal Survey of Youth uses a test, what is called the Peabody Individual Achievement Test. And this format is very similar to the ACT and SAT and other standardized tests. And they had students take this. And what they found, of all the variables that they were able to test, is that the greatest correlation between success was the mother's IQ score of that student. So even more so than income, even more so than where the child grew up in, geographically, for example, other life factors going on. They said the single biggest thing that affected how the student was going to do on the test was the IQ of their mother. Also had a 2006 study using data from the 2002 ACT scores. And what they did is they looked at some of the factors that were going on in different students. And they had 10 different things. And so one of these variables, we're going to find out which one of them had the biggest effect on how these kids did on this ACT back in 2002. Some of them were like self-efficacy, critical thinking, what high school you went to, what kind of family background do you have. And they had over 3,000 students complete this. They sent out questionnaires and they said, all right, I want you to fill this out for us and we'll compare it with your ACT score and we'll see how these things line up. Interestingly, for our purposes, when we look at income, they started with 10 different categories. And they said, okay, what do your parents make before taxes? And they started at about 18,000, and then they went up about 8,000 to 10,000 or so in every category. And students would just check that off. What researchers found is that depending on your race, you had different factors that influenced you more. If you're a Caucasian, your parents' income did seem to be the strongest correlation between your success with the ACT. African-American students, they found that students were most affected by the mastery of coping strategies. Another study took 23,000 students from the American Southeast, and they focused just on science. And we're going to figure out kind of these 10 factors are going to give the biggest correlation between success and failure. The income status did seem to be the biggest indicator of success on the science test. And what they did is they broke that down. Instead of giving it a hard number, they just said, are you on free lunch, or are you on reduced lunch, or are you paying for your lunch? So they had 3 larger categories as opposed to 10 smaller ones. And the fourth one was in 1995. This was a humongous study. Over 1 million students were involved. What they found was an even better correlation between your extracurricular participation and your SAT scores. You can see we've gathered the bottom 50 high schools in Kentucky by their composite ACT score, and the schools listed in the very first column. The second one is the composite ACT score of that school, an average. Okay. The zip code is in the next column, so where does that school reside in? And then the final column is from that U.S. Census data, where we take the zip code and we say, what is the median income of that zip code? And you can see we have our mean, our median, and mode for the ACT score and for the income. Let's compare that to our top 50 high schools. You can see DuPont Manual High School had the highest ACT scores that year. Their income of the zip code that they reside in is 30,318. So not a whole lot of difference, it would seem, between the top 50 and the bottom 50. There's our mean, median, and mode. Once again, you can see that the mean for the top 50 schools, $62,000, is significantly higher. The median of 57,000 is also higher. So side by side here, a little data analysis. On the left, we have the top 50 scores. On the right, we have the bottom 50 scores. You can kind of see that the red line, which represents income, is all over the place. We have a lot of instances where a school that is in the top 50 has one of the lower income levels. Look, the very first one is pretty low. That's supposed to be the highest ACT score, has one of the lower incomes. On the right side over here, on the bottom 50, you can see we have these peaks where we have schools that are over $75,000 in median income for that zip code, but yet they're in the bottom 50. So we're seeing some holes that are starting to be kind of poked into our hypothesis, or kind of with counterexamples. Here's another data analysis. We took the ACT score and compared it to the median family income using a scatter plot. Now the blue dots are going to be our top 50, the red are going to be our bottom 50. And if we were going to be proving our hypothesis, we would expect to see a pretty consistent blue on top, red on the bottom. And we see that in some instances, but it's not universal. You can see we have lots of counterexamples, especially when you get towards the right side of our data set. We have a lot of reds that are actually higher than the blues. Here's another analysis, income versus ACT score. And we just basically plotted ACT score versus income. And so you can see those bottom 50 schools are going to be on the left side. The top 50 schools will reside on the right side. And you can see there's a pretty big mix. There are instances where higher ACT scores do correspond to higher incomes. You see in the top right corner, a few of those. But you also have a lot of variance here, especially in the bottom. You can see there's not a whole lot of difference when it comes to income between those two data sets. This is where we started to run our linear regression models. When we compared the family median income of schools versus their composite ACT score, that R-squared value was a little over 1/10. And if you know about linear regression, 0 means that there's a smaller correlation. 1 means there's a greater correlation. And so that means this is a pretty weak trend line. There's not a whole lot of correlation. You can see they're pretty level when you look at the ACT scores and the median incomes. If we were going to have a correlation between those, we would expect a pretty solid line and those dots following along that trend line, but we're not seeing that. Side by side, so it's a little easier to see, we've compared a lot of our statistics between the top 50 high schools and the bottom 50 high schools and listed their differences. So you can see, there are significant differences in the ACT scores. But when it comes to income, what's interesting is that while there is a difference in your median income of 15,000, there's a difference in your average median income of 18,000. Look at your minimum median income. Less than $1,000 separates your top 50 high schools from your bottom 50 high schools. Really, what is significantly different is you have a few schools at the very top end of your spectrum of the top 50 high schools that are really skewing your data. Those schools that are in zip codes of median incomes that are over $100,000 are skewing a lot of your data. And so that's why you see the biggest difference in the maximum median income. A couple of notable examples that I was able to point out right away. This was number one, DuPont Manual High School. They had the highest test scores in the state. Yet their zip code was one of the bottom when it came to income levels. If you look at the schools that were in the bottom 50, we did have some schools with pretty significant median incomes that were in that bottom 50. Jeffersontown High School, for example, their zip code had an income of over $75,000. Yet they're one of the bottom 50 schools. So another counterexample going both ways of that argument. And then finally, look at that R-squared value. Like I said before, a little over at 1/10 is not going to do when it comes to linear regression. We need something much stronger than that if we're going to have some conviction between that claim of the correlation between income and standardized test scores. So basically, for your results, you're going to require further research to determine if this is a valid connection. Right now, the data is saying no. It may play a small role. It may be part of other variables that add to the overall equation to what helps with standardized test scores. But right now, we're not seeing enough of a correlation. If you look at the whole data set of top 50 versus bottom 50, you're just lining them up side by side like we saw in that table, you might be tempted to make that claim that, well, because the median is so different, because the average is so different, there must be a causation there or a correlation. But like I said before, not a strong enough correlation for our linear regression model, and too many counterexamples that we can go one way or the other. Either schools that score really well with low incomes, or schools that don't score very well with high incomes. My conclusion, does money equal standardized test success? Not really. There's a little bit of evidence, but not enough for us to say, yep, definitely. Look at, for example, the Everson and Millsap study. They kind of arrived at a similar conclusion. They said, hey, it's not just family income that tells the whole story. They believed, just like it appears in our data, that there are other factors that could also be be at play. They suggested extracurricular involvement. They suggested things like your mother's IQ, what high school you go to, for example. They said it makes a significant difference. And those are all factors that could be factoring into what we're seeing here in Kentucky. In conclusion, there's not enough adequate evidence to definitely say that yes, money equals success on the ACT score. We're seeing too many counterexamples. We're not seeing a strong enough correlation for this to pan out. When we went into this, we had several limitations that not all of our high schools test with the same amount of students. And so you have some variance year to year because you have some schools that have very small enrollment numbers. Take, for example, Jackson City, for example. There's only 14 students who took that test in 2019. So if you only have 14 students and one student does really well, or you have a handful of students that do really well, that's going to significantly raise the composite score of your school. So that can, year to year, really change how your school performs. Lafayette High School, for example, if you look at 2019 study, had over 500 students. So with that large enrollment, they're going to stay pretty consistent year to year. The other limitation is that not all schools draw from just one zip code, specifically the one that their school is actually located in. Take, for example, Ryle High School, which is a part of the Boone County schools. They draw from 4 different zip codes. So it's not just the one that their school resides in. They have multiple zip codes we're looking at here. So you have large sections that are very far away from that school that aren't being incorporated into our study because of how we did it. The median income for that school may be very different from the one that its zip code is located in. And limitation number 3 is that not all public high schools in Kentucky have the same admission processes. Basically, what that means is some of our schools have things like transfer students, where you can pay tuition to come into that county, even though you don't live in that county. Some of them do that without tuition, which it's just free. And we have some districts operating under the magnet system, which means you have schools that specialize in certain subjects, and you have students that are coming from all over the county to come to that school. Probably the most prominent example in Kentucky is the Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville. You're going to have students coming from one end of the county to the other one because that particular school maybe specializes in the subject that they're really interested in. So how do you account for that? That's a limitation. My first recommendation to address the fact that not all schools have the same amount of students is that maybe you stick with your top 50 and bottom 50 and only include schools that maybe have, let's say, 50 students, just to account for the variation. That gives you a little stronger data set for that particular zip code or that particular school than, let's say, 14 like we saw earlier. Limitation number 2 addresses the limitation that not all schools draw from multiple zip codes or from their own zip code. The recommendation is to find alternative ways of gathering information. The IRS is great, and the U.S. Census Bureau is great, how they give information out as far as zip code median incomes. But maybe you can give out some student profile questionnaires, or maybe even use the ones that the ACT has already done for you. You can see here, question number 59 asks students to estimate their family's income level. So you can use that data and not have to worry about if that student lives in this zip code or that zip code or this zip code. They're still going to be included in your study. Recommendation number 3 addresses the need that some schools draw from outside geographical boundaries. These are talking about the magnet schools, tuition schools, those kind of things. And I would say, let's just begin with multiple data sets. We just did all students from these 50 high schools, all students from these 50 high schools. But what if you began with our same data set and then pared it down into multiple different data sets and did multiple kind of studies on each one of those? One modification could be, we're going to take out magnet schools and we're going to put them in a separate category. So we'll have magnet schools versus traditional high schools. Another modification is you could be creating a separate data set for schools that have district transfers, or then have another set where schools that don't accept those. And a third modification could be transfers that are free versus schools that don't allow transfers at all. And we're just trying to find ways to get closer to truly representing the population that's inside of those building walls.